One of my favorite things I get to do as a data analyst is to visualize data. Typically, when I'm working on a project, I spend most of my time writing code in SQL to wrangle all the pieces of data that I need into a data extract. Then I plug that data extract into a data visualization platform. Now, in case you're not familiar with data visualization, it's basically the process of creating graphs and figures in a business intelligence tool using raw data. You're using your data to discover patterns and paint a picture of the business that you're working for. In my case, I'm working in healthcare, and so those patterns will often reveal the strengths and weaknesses in our delivery of patient care, the financial situation of the hospital, clinic, or healthcare system that I'm working for, the patient experience, issues in patient safety, among many other things. It would be difficult to try and get all of that information from a SQL script or query on its own, so often what is done is the query is placed inside a tool to translate that raw information into a dashboard or a viewable graph of some sort. There are many tools for this, but the two that I use the most are Tableau and Power BI. I do have a slight preference for Tableau just because I think it's easier to use. And so that's what I'm going to teach you today. But if you end up working as a data analyst or a data professional somewhere that uses Power BI, you could really quickly adapt to Power BI if you already know Tableau. Although the tools are different, the idea is basically the same. At its core, you're starting with a blank canvas and filling that canvas with graphs, figures, and tables, with a sprinkling of some calculations here and there. Now, there are multiple different Tableau products, but I'm going to just talk about two of them today. They're Tableau Public, which is the name of both the tool and the public space or gallery where you can show off your work. And then there's Tableau Desktop. The main differences between Tableau Public and Tableau Desktop are Tableau Public is free while Tableau Desktop is not. Tableau Public only allows you to save to the Tableau Public community to share your work, while Tableau Desktop allows you to save your work locally to your desktop. And then finally, while Tableau Desktop allows you to connect to many different SQL platforms or relational database management systems, Tableau Public is more limited in how you can connect your data. Despite the limitations of Tableau Public, it still has almost as many features as Tableau Desktop. It's completely free, and it allows you to quickly build up a portfolio. So we're going to be using the free version today. However, I will show you some of the features exclusive to Tableau Desktop as well. Just keep in mind that if you're working as a data analyst or a data professional at any organization that uses Tableau, you will probably be given the Tableau Desktop version. Many organizations even go a step further and use Tableau Server, which is sort of like a proprietary version of Tableau Public or a proprietary gallery where employees and contractors with the company can build work based off of the company data, publish it somewhere, and only give access on a need-to-know basis. Now, to get started with Tableau Public, which is the free version, go to the link that I provided, click Download Tableau Public, and then the installation process is very straightforward. Once you've done that, come back to this lesson and we will get started learning Tableau. All right, so before we get started, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to navigate to datawizardry.academy. If you click on resources, there should be a link to this Tableau Basics in Healthcare, and you're just going to provide your first name and email and click Get Lesson Files. Then you're going to be emailed a CSV file that you can use to connect to the Tableau workbook. Now, this is actually a preview of my Module 4 of my Clinical Analytics Accelerator course, so I hope you enjoy. And with that, let's get started with our lesson. All right, so here's an example of some of the stuff that you can build with Tableau. This is just a simple dashboard that I created based off of our Cynthia data source that we were working with in SQL. So you can see we've got our encounters over time. You can see that we have an age histogram here, which shows the age and the frequency within each age bin. We've got the total quantity of encounters. This is for 2022, so I should specify 2022 here. And we've got number of patients, inpatient average length of stay, ER median time, so the emergency room, how long it took somebody to get through the emergency department from start to finish. We've got the top 10 reasons why someone was brought to the hospital. And then we also have the payer mix. So who are our most popular insurance plans for our patients? And you can see that Medicare is the most common one, followed by Medicaid and Humana. So as you can see, what you can do with Tableau is it allows you to gather vital information about the company that you're working for, in our case, a hospital. And what I did was I actually wrangled all of this data using this query to pull all this data against our fictional healthcare system here. Now, a little bit about this data set. This is basically looking at all of the encounters that we had in the year 2022 within our healthcare system. Start and stop refers to the start and stop time of the encounter. Encounter class is going to come in different forms, but there's inpatient, which refers to patients that stayed in a hospital for multiple days. Outpatient is where the patient had some kind of visit that only took a day at most. Ambulatory is basically the same thing as outpatient. Hospice is where a patient is at the end of their life and they're often receiving comfort care measures. There's other types of encounter classes here, but I won't go through them all. Encounter type just lends more context to the encounter class. We've got some information pertaining to cost, the organization, but in this scenario, we're just pretending like all of this is part of the same healthcare system. We've got the reason the encounter occurred, the payer of that encounter, like what insurance company was involved. This column gives us more information about what type of payer it is, whether it's private or government. We got this patient identification number and their information like their birth date, race, ethnicity, zip code, whether or not they had the flu shot in 2022, whether or not they are up to date on their COVID shots. This is the name of the organization, the zip code of the organization, the city, and the state. So that's all the information that we're working with today. It's basically just all the encounters that we had at our healthcare system in the year 2022, as well as relevant information about the patient that went to that encounter. You can see that it's in a tabular format. And when you're looking at data in a tabular format like this, it's really hard to really understand what's going on with our hospital or our clinics that we oversee. There's just too much going on here. There's really no patterns that emerge from this tabular format of data. So what we do is we take this query and we plug it into Tableau. And by doing that, we can start to see some patterns and trends that emerge. What's also really powerful about Tableau is when you build dashboards like this, it allows you to often interact with that dashboard if you set it up right. So for example, I have a filter here that I've pulled out of one of these worksheets, and you can have it affect all of your worksheets or a number of your worksheets or a portion of your worksheets. So right now it's looking at all the different types of encounters. I could set this just to ambulatory and you can see it change a little bit. And I also have these dynamic labels that specify, okay, this is ambulatory encounters over time, meaning outpatient, or something that only takes less than a day to accomplish. Okay, like maybe a checkup visit, or maybe it's a very straightforward surgery, like a same-day surgery. You've got emergency visits, you have hospice care, inpatient, outpatient and ambulatory. We're going to combine those later. You've got virtual visits, you've got wellness visits. You can see all of that update with the click of this button here. What's really nice about tools like this is that if you work at a company or a healthcare organization, a lot of these dashboards are set up so that they are self-service, meaning that anyone that has the proper security to the dashboard can interact with them and see the patterns emerge from their data. So oftentimes as a data analyst, you're going to be building stuff like this fairly regularly, and you're going to build dashboards in a way that helps your service line managers, like people that manage a neurosciences clinic or the emergency department or a surgery ward. You're going to help clinicians and managers of those departments understand how that hospital is performing on a wide variety of different metrics. So long story short, you've got your SQL, which allows you to pull the data out of a database, and then you have things like Tableau or Power BI that allow you to paint a picture, tell a story with the data, find patterns in your data. Typically, when I build some sort of dashboard, I'm going to use some combination of line graphs, and I'm going to have these metrics here that just show a number. I'm going to have some bar graphs, but there's a lot of other things you can do with Tableau. You can create donut charts, you can create area graphs, you can create pie charts and tree maps and highlight tables. There's so many different types of data visualizations that I'm going to show you in my course, but we're going to start off with some really basic visualizations just to kind of whet your appetite a little bit for this material. So I'm going to start from scratch here, and I'm going to load Tableau Public, and I'm going to connect to a text file that I've already prepared in advance. So I'm going to load my DW Tableau intro tutorial file. Now, assuming that you're using Tableau Public, the free version of Tableau, what I did was I basically took this SQL query that I had developed in advance, which gives me just kind of a well-rounded understanding of our fictional healthcare system that we're working for. And I downloaded this to a CSV file, and I'm just connecting my Tableau Public to that file. Now, if you wanted to not use a CSV file and instead plug in this query against the database directly, you could do that, but you'd have to use Tableau Desktop, which is not free. So I'll show you how to do that really quickly. Right now I'm using a free trial of Tableau Desktop, but this is what it's going to sort of look like. I'm going to go to a server of some sort. So I'm going to click More, and I'm using Postgres, so I would look for Postgres SQL. And then you would just enter in your database, your port, your server, your username and password, and then you would plug in your initial SQL right here to get that started. Now, in order for this code to work, another thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to establish ODBC connection or a JDBC connection, which I will talk about in future lessons, but basically it's the instructions that allow tools like Tableau to be able to connect to your database. I'm not going to cover that in this lesson, but I'll cover that in future lessons. So here I've switched back to Tableau Public. I am connected to my CSV file. I can actually see my encounter identification number, the start and stop times of the encounter. I can see the encounter class, the encounter type. So that is looking good. And to kick things off, I'm going to click on Sheet 1 to start a worksheet. Now, there are 3 different icons here that I want to draw your attention to. We are already in a canvas for a worksheet here, and this blank canvas is where we're going to build our bar graphs, or our line graphs, or our tables, or our figures, or our charts. You're going to have multiple worksheets that form a dashboard. So, for example, I'm just going to fill this in with something. Test 1 is what I'll call it. Then I'll create another one. Test 2. Okay, so I create Test 1 and Test 2. And then I've got my 2 worksheets that I can drag into my dashboard. Now, obviously this doesn't look very good right now. This is just blank space, but I just want to drive the point home that you build different components, which are called sheets. It's going to be individualized graphs, and then all of those will come together in the end in a dashboard, or they'll come together in a story. This is the 3rd type of thing that you can build in Tableau. You've got worksheets, dashboards, and stories. So if I were to return to my completed example here, all of this stuff, these individual things that I've pulled into this dashboard are worksheets. So you've got multiple worksheets that come together in a dashboard. Or they could come together in a story, which has this sort of book icon, while the dashboard has this grid icon, and the worksheets don't have any icon. They just have a title here. Stories are really useful when you want to have a very specific narrative that you are trying to encourage the viewer of your story to see, rather than giving them a self-service experience where they can glean insights and patterns on their own. Now, one thing I'll say about stories before I continue is that stories I don't really see utilized very much in the healthcare space. and I see dashboards used far more commonly. So our focus in this course is going to be on the dashboards and not the stories. But here you can see my dashboard, and then here are the individual worksheets that are contributing to that dashboard. Let's flip back to my blank canvas here. I'll go back to sheet 1. I'm gonna just clear out all this stuff that I created earlier and just start from scratch here. Now that I've cleared everything, let's talk about the layout that we're working with here in the worksheets. So over here on the left side, this panel is going to show you all of the columns that are coming from our data set. So we explored all of these earlier, but you've got the birthday, the encounter reason, blah, blah, blah. You've got all these columns coming here. Now you'll notice that there's these little icons that show up to the left of every column. So what these mean is you've got this birthday cake here. That just refers to a date of some sort, okay? ABC, that just refers to what are called string or text-based fields. Those are both the same thing, string and text. So you might hear me refer to that interchangeably. You've got this globe icon here. What that refers to is the geographic entity that we're working with. So if you right click on this, you'll notice that there's this button called geographic role. And you've got all these different types of geography that you can define on some of these. In this case, we're looking at the city. If I were to right click and I go here, it's already recognized as being a city. Tableau just automatically detected that. What Tableau attempts to do when it has this globe icon is it attempts to create a latitude and longitude approximately for each of the cities or the states or the zip or whatever you have that could be geographically defined. So in our case, this data set takes place in Massachusetts, and Tableau sees this city, Great Barrington. It says, okay, I'm going to give you the latitude and longitude for Great Barrington. And this one over here, Norwell, Wellfleet. It sees that city and attempts to resolve it into a latitude and longitude. Sometimes it gets a little confused when you do that though. For example, I'm in the Seattle area. If I were to put Seattle in my data set and I drag city to my canvas here, Tableau probably wouldn't be confused by that. I don't think there's any other city called Seattle other than the one in Washington State. But Seattle does reside in King County, and I wouldn't be surprised if Tableau got confused by King County because there's probably lots of King counties in the United States. So sometimes Tableau will get confused by the options that it gets presented with, in which case you might have to help specify what exact location you're referring to if there are multiples that it's competing with. So sometimes what you might have to do is if Tableau doesn't recognize a certain entry for a geography type, there are some options you can go into to help Tableau be more specific about which King County you're referring to in that example. Sometimes you'll see these birthday cakes with a clock next to it. That refers to date, time. So if I were to drag this over to rows, for example, and I just clicked exact date, and then I'm just going to make that discrete, you can see that it's showing the exact timestamp, not only the date, but the exact timestamp of our encounters. Now these hashtag pound symbols that you see here, these represent numeric data types. So for example, we've got this base encounter cost. So if I were to pull in the encounter identification number, and then that represents every single encounter that happened only one time. And then if I drag base encounter cost over here, I can see the cost that is associated with each encounter. So you can see that this is very much a numeric type of data here. You may have also noticed that there's a little gray line here that divides the top from the bottom. These columns here are blue and then these ones are green. And then if I hover over each of these columns, you'll notice that there's sort of a green highlighted pill, and these are blue highlighted pills. The section above that gray line there is going to represent your discrete columns. the section below is going to be your continuous columns. And before I explain why that's important, let me also explain what cards and shelves are. This is where Tableau gets a little confusing with their terminology, but there are cards and then there are shelves. Cards are like these things here: pages, filters, marks, and many cards also have shelves. For example, these columns and rows cards have shelves that allow you to store your columns. If I wanted to create a bar graph that quantified the number of encounters and stratified that by payer type, like Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, what I would do is I might start by pulling the payer column over to rows. I can see that this created my rows, and I'm going to create a calculation that counts my rows. So I'm going to say row count. I'm just going to put the number 1 here. I'm going to drag row count over here, and that's looking good, but I want this to be in a bar graph format. So I'll actually take this and drag it to columns, and then I'm going to sort it. So columns and rows are going to define the orientation of your visualization. So in summary, what I did was I created this list of pairs from our data set, and then I created a calculation. So this is another thing you can do in Tableau. You can click here and then say create a calculated field, and then create a new column in your data set. That's basically what I've done with row count. With this calculation, I basically just created a new column in my data set that just gives me the number 1. And it just lists it out for every single row under that column. And that's helpful for us because we can now basically count the number of records under each category here. And if I went back to data source and I scroll all the way to the right here, you can see that new calculation that I built. It just always shows up as 1. This is one of the things I always do when I create a new file in Tableau. I create this row count column so that I can count how many rows of data I'm getting in my data set, so I can visualize things really quickly. And when you create a calculation like row count, you're going to see this equal sign next to it, indicating that this is a calculation or a formula that you just built. Now, a moment ago, I had talked about these blue pills and these green pills. So what's the significance of that? Well, your blue pills are going to list out some entity here discretely. It's going to list out these things separately in a non-continuous way. It's going to define sort of like this header that we see here. And this green pill is going to give you a sort of continuum. It's going to give you a continuous range of things. And that can be numeric or it can be in a date format, but you can expect to see some kind of axis that you can manipulate here. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you're sorting, you cannot sort on the green pills. You can only sort on the blue pills. So I could sort it like this. I could sort it like this. I could right click on the blue pill. I could say sort, and I could do it manually if I wanted to. I don't usually do it manually, but that is something that you can do if you want. For now, I'm just going to keep it in descending order based upon the row count. You've also got a button here where you can click this to swap the orientation. So whereas before the pair was defining the rows and the row count was defining the columns, I click this and now that's in reverse. Now the pair has become the columns and the rows have become row count. But I'm going to switch that back because I like this orientation better. Now, I'm not really crazy about these being named columns and rows, and I instead like to think of them like how the graph is going to be oriented. If you ever are confused about how this is going to look, I like to look at these little lines and dots that you see, these icons next to columns and rows. If you're dragging something to the rows shelf, just keep in mind that if it's rows, you can see that that's sort of vertically oriented. We've got these little lines and dots next to each thing. It's basically saying this is going to define your data vertically, and then this, the columns, is going to define everything horizontally. So if I were to put race next to pair, you can see that it continues to flesh this out in the vertical direction, It just gets more specific. If I were to drag that over to columns instead, you can see that instead it's getting expanded out horizontally. Just going to take that back out. Now, another thing I'll mention about the green pill is that oftentimes what you're doing with it is you're aggregating it in some way. I'm going to show you a different example. I'm going to swap this out with a different one, like the encounter cost or the total claim cost. So I'll put this over here to represent the dollar amount that we have for total claim cost for each of these payers. So I'm going to drag that to column. I'm going to sort in descending order. So now what this is doing is I've given it a new continuous measure to look at and summing all of the claim costs. So if I go back to my data source and I look for the column that says total claim cost, it's saying, all right, this is part of Medicare. All right, add that up, add it to this one, which is also Medicare, and then add it to this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. These are all Medicare. Every time it sees Medicare, it's going to add that up. So all of these would be included. And it's going to list the final number right here. It's going to do that for each of these different payers, Medicaid, Humana, Medicare. But if we wanted to, we could do the average instead. So we could tell Tableau to take all of these Medicare entries. These Medicare entries, it would take all of them into one single list, and it would take the average, or it could take the maximum charge or the minimum charge. So if you went back to that green pill, you could say, take the average. Now United Healthcare on average has the higher total claim cost. Or you could say median, you could say count, you could look at this by maximum. And when we look at maximum, you can see that Humana had the highest total claim cost out of all the encounters that we had. There's all sorts of different aggregation options you can select from if you just right click and go to measure and then pick from these different options. I'm going to remove this and I'm going to go back to my row count. I'm going to sort that in descending order. Now I talked a little bit about the columns and rows shelves. Now let's talk about the filters shelf. Let's say that I'm not interested in this no insurance category. One thing I could do is I could right click here and then I could say exclude. Notice immediately what happens when I do that. So I got this pill here that says payer. If I were to left click here and then edit filter, you'll notice that it is now kicking out this no insurance option. If I remove this and I try something else, let's say that I wanted to look at birth date. I want to look at older patients. Let's say that I go to range of dates and I say ending date, and this person couldn't have had a birth date that was later than the year 1960, let's say. So 12/31/1960. So now you can see there's a lot more Medicare showing up here in this data set for 2022. And in fact, if I right click here and I go to show filter, now I have this option to just dynamically adjust that. And you can add multiple columns to the filters shelf if you want to. I could say, let's look at the encounter class and say I'm only interested in emergency visits. If I do that and I right click and I go to show filter, and I go to this arrow here and I say single value drop down, now I can just modify the encounter class and see how that affects the data at the same time that I'm adjusting this filter here. If you want to clear whatever you have visualized right now really quickly, you can just click this button here, which I'm going to do now. And I'm going to start building a graph that we can use in a dashboard. So I'm going to take my payer again, so I'll drag that to rows. I want to create a bar graph, so I'm going to take my row count. I'm going to drag that over to columns. I'm going to sort that in descending order. Now I want you to look at this marks card. The marks card has a shelf where you can drag something from the shelf to these little cards within this card. You've got color, size, label, detail, tooltip. If I were to hold down the control key, or I suppose if you're using a Mac, that would be the command key, you can hold that key down, left click here. If you start to drag it a little bit over, you can see this icon starts to emerge. And if it shows that plus sign, that means you're creating a copy of this pill here. And then if I drag that to color and I release, look what happens now. Now I have this gradient scheme that starts to color in my bar graph quite nicely. So one of the other properties of this green pill is that if you drag that to color, you're going to see this nice continuous gradient. Now you might be asking, what's the difference in holding down the control key and dragging this to color versus going to row count here and dragging this to color? And the answer is there is no difference. They're exactly the same. I'm just lazy. This is a shorter distance for me compared to going from here to here. So sometimes I'll just be lazy, I'll hold down the control key so I can get this to show up here. If I had not held down the control key while dragging this from here to here, that would disappear from the columns. So if you're going to use this shortcut, just make sure you're using the control key to create a copy of this and also keeping this here in the columns section. But if you're not comfortable doing that, just keep in mind that you could have just taken the row count here and drag that to color. Now the color gives us a lot of customization. We don't necessarily need to stick with the default color here. I could click here, I could left click and then go to edit colors, and I could pick something different. I could pick this sunrise color if I wanted to. I could pick purple. I could even select the exact color that I want here. That looks a little bit too light though, so I don't like that. You can have this sort of red, green, gold diverging color scheme, and you can even click this advanced option to specify where you want some of these colors to start diverging. So you could even incorporate certain targets in your data set if you wanted to, where everything above a certain number is red or orange, and then something below that is green, or you could do the reverse. If it's bad to be low on a certain number, if it goes below a target, you can make it red, and if it goes above the target, you can make it green. So much customization that you can implement in the color scheme. You can also make this stepped so that it has a sort of predefined progression in the color scheme. This button will reverse the color scheme if you want it to. You can say that you want to use a full color range here if you want. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on this again, edit colors, and then I'm just going to stick with my blue because I think it's good enough. Now one interesting thing about this color scheme is that this green pill is sort of dictating what this is going to look like. It's going to tell it to be a sort of continuous gradient. What would happen if I dragged a blue pill to color instead of the green pill? Well, let's take that off for a second and see what happens. If I hold down my control key and I create a copy of this pill and drag it to color, now I can see it looks really busy, looks very noisy. There's all these different colors defining each of these things. And the reason that happens is because we are no longer using a continuous pill to drive the coloration of this graph. Instead, Tableau sees all these discrete, separate entities. It doesn't know how to quantify them, so instead it just assigns each one a different color. So this can be handy if you're not looking to use a continuous color scheme. A good example of this is if you create a calculation that says that some value is reaching target and other values are not reaching target. That would be a nice use case for a discrete field that you can drag to colors so that you can show bars that are green for on target and red for not on target, which I'll show you later. But if you have all these colors like this, it starts to look really ugly, really fast. I try to avoid using more than 3 or 4 colors in my dashboard, so I would be really cautious with having this many colors represented in your dashboard or your worksheet. So I'm going to remove pair from this. I'm going to go back to using my row count, my continuous pill, to define this nice gradient that we see here. Let's explore some of the other marks options. I can also take this and I can hold down the control key to create a copy of it once again, And now I'm going to drag it to size. Now what's happening is that these bar graphs are getting wider based upon how many encounters we have. So Medicare had the most encounters, so it's going to be the widest, followed by Medicaid, Humana, and it's still retaining that same color scheme that we have, where Medicare is the darkest because it has the highest number of encounters. I think that looks a little too busy though. I don't think it looks very good, so I'm not going to use that. I'm just going to drag this off so that we can get this back to normal. Next we have this label button here. So if I again hold down the control key and I left click on it and I drag that to label, now what that's going to do is it's going to list out the number of encounters next to each bar. So this is very handy. I like to keep these labels next to the bar rather than using the axis because I think that's cleaner. So if you wanted to hide this, you could right click here and you could unclick the show header. Now your brain kind of fills in what the axis used to be by seeing the numbers here next to each bar. And if you clicked on that label again, you could adjust this even further. You could blow up the font size if you wanted to, but you'll notice now that once I do that, some of them disappear because now Tableau is competing for space. It tries to think ahead and say, okay, well, if it gets too busy, it's going to be hard to read, so I will make some of these disappear in the interest of making it more readable. If you want to force it to show all of that, you can click this option here that says allow labels to overlap other marks. I like to make sure that everything is showing up by just clicking a small enough font size. And another thing you could do is drag this to the point where all of them start to show up as well. If I go back to my label, I can also pick a different font if I wanted to. I could pick a different color. I could make this bold or italicized, but I like the way it was. So I'm just going to go back. I'm going to hit I've been hitting the Control Z button here to kind of go backwards. By the way, if you don't want to use Control or Command Z to undo your steps and you want to do this the manual way, you can click these arrow buttons. This undo button is equivalent to Control Z. The redo button is equivalent to Control Y. Now, one other thing I'll mention about the label is that you can adjust the alignment here. So if I wanted this to be in the center of the bar graph, you can do that. You can make it right at the base here if you wanted to, but then you got to keep in mind that sometimes it's hard to read. Sometimes Tableau will adjust that for you as you play around with the bar size. So that can look nice. I'm just going to keep things simple and leave it at the tip. So I'm going to go back here to the right alignment. Now detail is a little bit trickier and not as intuitive to understand, but suppose that you wanted to break this up into smaller pieces. Let's say that you wanted to look at these different pair types and see what proportion of a certain race received Medicare or Medicaid or Humana. Let's say that you wanted to do a sort of disparities analysis in our care and see if there are a greater proportion of one race compared to another receiving a certain payer type. Well, what you could do is you could go to race here, you go to detail, and now you see these different shades kind of representing the different races. You can also drag that to color and then have this take on a completely different coloration. Now you can see that this race field here, this column, is the discrete type of measure. It's a blue pill, so it's not going to give us a gradient anymore. Instead, it's going to give us these discrete colorations. So now you can see the proportion of each race in relation to each of these pair types. So you've got white, you've got other, Native, Hawaiian, Black, and Asian. I'm going to hit Control Z 2 times to just go back to what we had before. Now, one of the last things I'll mention about this marks card here, notice this little menu that pops up when I hover over each bar. This is called a tooltip. A tooltip is one of the unsung heroes of creating a dashboard. You're basically giving the viewer more information about the visualization that you're building by hovering over each entity in that visualization. You can customize this a lot. You can say, this represents the pair associated with the patient in their encounter. if you wanted to make this more clear. You could have some sort of narrative that pops up here. Or you could drag something else, some other column to this to show more information about that patient. So for example, if you wanted to see the total quantity of patients that had the flu shot for each of these pairs, I could do that pretty easily by just going to tooltip here, and then I say flu shot, and then I can insert sum of flu 2022. Now you can see flu shot 2,410, 6,111, 2,381. You can see how many encounters were there where that patient was immunized against the flu. I'm just going to drag that off for now of the tooltip, and I don't think this narrative is necessary, so I'm just going to delete that and click OK. One other thing that I'll mention about some of these other options is that for label, you could add extra stuff to the labels if you wanted to. So if I drag COVID over to label and then I expand out these bars to be a little bit wider, now the top number shows all of the encounters where the patient was represented by Medicare. The bottom number shows all the patients represented by Medicare that had an encounter where they were at the time up to date with their COVID shots. But again, that's busy. I'm going to drag that off. Just keep in mind that you can add multiple labels if you want to. Let's reduce that bar size again. Now on the marks card, we've got this drop down here, which actually gives you the specific type of visualization that you want to put onto this canvas. It's on automatic right now. If I clicked bar, this would give me the exact same thing because it defaulted to a bar graph. If I wanted to make this a line graph, I could. It doesn't really look meaningful in this case, so I won't use that. There's area, there's square, circle, shape, and you can specify the type of shape you want here. Text, map, pie, Gantt, polygon, and density. Some of these, like the map and the pie and the Gantt chart, they aren't really fully calibrated in the way that they're supposed to be calibrated. So I will show you better examples of how those are supposed to be set up and how those look later on. But just keep in mind that right now, the data that we're working with lends itself best to a bar graph format, so that's what we're going to be using here. You also have this show me format. So what it does is it just kind of rearranges things in the way that it thinks is going to be most meaningful. So I could click on this for highlight table, and it's using this square down. It's orienting all the data in the way that it thinks would be the most meaningful. I could click on text tables to get it to just be a sort of table format here. You could click here, you could click here. You can make a tree map here, so that gives you almost like a pie chart except in a boxy sort of squared format. There's all sorts of options that you can experiment with on the Show Me tab. Sometimes I'll click on Show Me if I want to quickly build a visualization and I'm confident that Tableau is going to not be confused by the button that I click here. Sometimes it just kind of gives me meaningless data. So I just went ahead and pressed Control-Z to get back to my original graphic here, my formatted bar graph. And so now you might be asking, well, which one do I use? Do I use Show Me or do I use the marks, like this drop down on the marks? Well, I find myself using both quite often, but if I'm really confident and I know exactly how I want to design my bar graph or my line graph or whatever data visualization I might be using, I'm going to spend most of my time doing it here. And it's hard to use this when you're first starting out because you don't exactly know where the pills are supposed to go. I promise it gets easier with practice. But if you're not feeling confident in getting a bar graph or a line graph or whatever from this drop down, then just know that you can use this Show Me as a sort of training wheels for you to get used to where things are going to go. And I encourage you to just kind of pay attention to where the pills are going when you click on these different things and experiment with them to know how Tableau has a tendency to place those columns. All right, so we have analyzed the heck out of this worksheets tab and like the layout and everything, let's actually start building this dashboard. So I'm going to do some formatting here. I'm going to right click here. I'm going to go to format. And what I think is a really nice touch is doing a sort of band formatting here. So if you go to shading here and you click rows, going to this paint bucket and rows, that's going to highlight whatever we have in the rows section, that's pairs. And I'm going to adjust the header portion of this to have a sort of shaded look and feel here. I don't necessarily like how this looks on the pane though, so I'm going to get rid of that banding on the pane. I'll drag this out a little bit more. I'll go to I'm going to right click here and format to adjust this header here to make it a little bit bolder. So I will make that bold. I'll blow it up a little bit so it's size 10. Now this no insurance looks kind of ugly, and we can change that. I'm going to right click here and I'm going to go to edit alias. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to change this from no insurance to just regular case, uppercase on the first letter of those words. So it looks a little bit like the others here. And what that does is it basically goes to that column pair and it says anytime you see no insurance like in uppercase, it's going to adjust it so that it's now no insurance. So it's not an uppercase anymore. It looks a little bit cleaner now. And on the subject of renaming things, not only can you do this edit alias option to change the contents within a column, but you can change the name of a column itself. So let's look at encounter class, for example. I don't like how that's one word, so I could rename this column by right clicking. I could go to rename, and then I could add a space right there. And that looks a little bit better. I want to name this sheet something other than sheet 1. So if I go to sheet 1 and I type encounters by pair, spelled encounters there, you can see that as soon as I do that, it actually updates this thing right here. Another thing that I like to do is I like to right click, format title, and I like to shade this a little bit. I think it might look nice if I use this one right here. And I'm going to left click on this. I'm going to make this bold, Tableau medium. I think that looks pretty good, so I'm going to stick with that. Somehow this header showed up for me again. I'm going to hide that because we don't need that. We've got all of these labelings here. So, we don't need the axis if we can already see it with our eye labeled on each of these bars. So we've got our first worksheet built. We still need to build all this stuff, but that should actually be pretty quick. So I'm going to flip back to my working Tableau file, and I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to duplicate. This one I'm going to call top 10 encounters by reason. All right, so that updates. We've got the same formatting. I just want to make this encounter reason now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove pair here. I'm going to take this encounter reason, I'm just going to plop that in right there. Going to sort this so that it is in descending order. I'm going to drag that out a little bit. There are so many reasons for a patient showing up to the hospital or the clinic though, and we don't necessarily want all of these. So what I can do is I can actually specify that I just want the top 10. So I'm going to use my control key to drag a copy of this over here. You can go to top and then you can click by field and then you can just say top 10. You apply that and there you go. You now have top 10 encounters by reason. So just a nice way to narrow down your data really quickly. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to build these metrics here. Now to do that, let's start with number of encounters. So if I start a new worksheet, I'm going to go over to I could either use row count or I could use encounter ID. The encounter ID is going to uniquely represent every single encounter in this data set. Encounter ID is not going to show up more than once. So I could do row count here to count all of the encounters, or I could use encounter ID. I could right click here and I could say count. Okay, that's still going to give me the same number, but I'm just going to do row count. Now we have the number, we just need to show somewhere that this is the encounters. So to do that, which one do you think we would click? I want you to pause the video for a second, maybe think about it, maybe try it for like 30 seconds, and then resume the video and then I'll show you. All right, so what I would do is I would just go to text and then click this ellipses here, number of encounters, and there you go. So now you've got number of encounters, you've got 21,669. That is very small. So I'm going to go back to text here and click on these ellipses again, and maybe I'll make that like 18. See how that looks? Number of encounters, 21,669. I'll maybe unbold the number, or I will unbold the title and then bold the number. See how that looks? I like that better. I'm gonna left align this. I don't need this sheet number 3 here, but it is good practice to label these worksheets. So I'll just say number of encounters. Given that that's redundant though, you can just right click and then hide that title. Okay, so if we flip back to this dashboard, we can just copy this thing that I built and then paste it over 3 more times and then just tweak the settings so that we have the appropriate data values showing up in each one, and we just tweak the title as well. So I'll switch back to this. I'm going to duplicate, duplicate, duplicate. First one is number of patients. I'm just going to name this worksheet number of patients. Go to text. We're going to say number of patients. All right. And before I switch this out, I just need to find the patient identification number. This is going to represent all of your patients, but they could show up multiple times because one patient could have multiple encounters. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to do a count distinct on this. I'm going to drag this over here. Right now it's a blue pill. I'm going to convert it to a green pill, and I'm going to do that by right clicking, and I'm going to go to measure, and I'm going to say count distinct. I'm going to pull this off, and then I'm going to take this count distinct of the patient ID and I'm going to drag it to text. Now it actually annoyingly removed my header here, so I'll just type that in again. Number of unique patients. I believe that was 18, Tableau medium, and I'll apply that, see how that looks. Gonna put the colon here. Let's go back to this one and just double check the formatting. It's actually Tableau book 18, so I'll go back here, Tableau book 18, left aligned, and then we'll bold this part like we did before. All right, so that one is now complete. We got this one and we got that one. Now for this next thing here, we're going to need to create a calculation. Average length of stay is simply you take the start time of the encounter and the stop time of the encounter and you take the difference. And this is reserved for inpatient length of stay. So we're going to set a filter so that the encounter class is inpatient, and it's going to calculate that time difference between the time that the encounter started and the time that the encounter stopped. So I'm back in my working Tableau file, and I'm going to call this inpatient ALOS. So the first step is we're going to create a new calculation. So what I did was I went to Analysis, Create Calculated Field. Another way I can get to that is by going to this arrow, go to Create Calculated Field, and then I'm just going to say length of stay. And then we're going to take the average of that later. So these are all of the functions that you can use in Tableau, and further along in this class, we're going to really explore these functions. We're going to go into a very deep dive into these functions, and you're going to see all of the things that you can do with calculations. But for now, If you're not sure what I'm doing, don't worry, it will make more sense later on in future lessons as we practice more of these. But I'm just going to find a function that takes the difference between two date values. So I'm going to say date diff. So that's date diff. You can see it says date part, start date, and end date. Date part simply refers to the way that we want to summarize the data. What is the output? Is it going to be in days? Is it going to be in months? Is it going to be in years? I'm just going to say day. So I have to have these single quotes, these apostrophes around this thing here. And I'm just going to say day, all lowercase, not plural. Okay. And then I'm going to say, this error message is blocking me, but okay, start date and end date. So the start date is going to just be start. You're going to use brackets here to refer to that column. And then the other one is going to be stop. And you can see that it turns orange to indicate that it is pulling in that column. It says the calculation is valid, so it is working. I hit apply. We have now created a column that takes the difference between the end of the encounter and the start of the encounter. And I said that we're going to make this an inpatient calculation only. So I'm going to set a filter that makes this just inpatient. It's still set to the wrong stuff up here. So what I need to do is I need to drag this thing to my marks shelf. It's just kind of like a temporary holding place right now for it. I'm going to right click on my length of stay, and I'm going to call this average to make it the average length of stay. Now I'm going to drag this to text. I'm going to go up here to text again. I'm going to remove the row count because we don't want the number of inpatient encounters. We want the average length of stay. I'll just say inpatient, ALOS. Now that one is complete. I don't like how this has an extra decimal point though. Nobody needs to know that much detail. So to change that, you can go to this average length of stay, right click, go to format, go to the numbers here, and then the number custom is going to adjust this. One more thing I like to do is I just like to specify days if that weren't already clear. Just by looking at this and someone wasn't familiar with average length of stay, I'll just type days there. 4.5 days. All right, I'm going to click on this last one, and this is going to be the ER median time. I'm going to click on text. I'll go to these ellipses here. ER median time. And I'm just going to remove this for now. We'll name this something, ER median time. And because we only want emergency room encounters, I'm going to go to encounter class, drag that up here, set this to emergency. Now what's nice about this last calculation that we built, length of stay, is that it already kind of lends itself to this. It's kind of like length of stay, except now we want to measure it in minutes. So all I need to do with this calculation is I just need to right click, duplicate this. I'll go to duplicate, I'm going to right click and edit, and I'll just say median ER time, and then I'll say minute start and stop, apply that. And now that we've completed that formula, I'm just going to left click and drag this over here. It's taking the sum of the minutes though. We don't want that, we just want the average. And we also got this other one we don't want, so I'm going to remove that, right click here, go to measure sum, and go to average. Actually, let's make that a median. So I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to make this a median because averages tend to be skewed a lot by outliers, whereas medians give you a very true middlemost point in your data set. So I like the median better. And then I'm going to go to text, and I'm going to say mins to abbreviate for minutes. All right, so those are complete. These are just my text-based metrics. And then going back to my completed dashboard, we got two more here. We've got the line graph and we have this histogram. I'm going to start a new worksheet and I'm going to call this encounters over time. Encounters over time. And I want you to try and think through this and see if you can build this on your own, because the more you practice, the more you're going to get used to conjuring up a line graph or a bar graph, and the more it becomes muscle memory. So maybe pause the video for 2 minutes, see if you can struggle through this. If you can, great. And if you don't get it, that's okay. You just got to keep practicing. All right, so assuming you've taken a couple minutes to try working through this, I'm going to show you how I would do this. So first I'm going to go to the start time or the stop time. You got to basically pick one of these and decide, do I want this to be based off of the start time, or do I want it to be based off of the stop time? I'm going to go with the start time. And if we think about this, we want this to be kind of structured with these points kind of going horizontally. So what did we learn earlier about columns and rows? Well, you can see from this icon here that we have this sort of horizontal orientation in our columns. So my first instinct would be to take the data point that I'm choosing here, the start time, and I'm putting it here. But you might be thrown off at first because it gives you this year here. What's that about? Well, it defaults to the year. If I want this to be more like the dashboard that I created, well, we've got like the months and the year here. So to mess with the settings here, you could right click, and then you've got the choice between this section and this section. This mirrors the format that we have over here. This is like your discrete entries, and this is your continuous entries. I'm going to pick month here to get the month and year combination. It's going to be in a continuous format. If I had right clicked and I said month instead, it's just going to give me the month over all the years within our data set. Either one would have worked because this is only the year 2022, but my default option is to always start with this month-year combination for the most part. So now we've got these empty spaces here. Now what I need to do is I need to count the number of encounters over each of these time periods. So I'm just going to go to my trusty row count. I'll drag that over here. Looks kind of weird over here because we have some data points now that where it started in 2021. I'm just going to hover over those and just exclude those because those don't really lend anything to the analysis. And now it's starting to take shape. Tableau just kind of already knew that this is a line graph. But if it didn't already know that that was a line graph, if it defaulted to something like this, just remember that we would go to this mark section, left click, and then just go to line. Now I'm going to right click here, edit the axis, and I'm going to remove this include 0. Now you might have been taught to never show a line graph that does not include 0 in the axis. There are certain circumstances where you can get away with not having the 0 there, but I'm not going to go into those reasons today. I just think this looks better for our demo, so I'm just going to keep it. I'm going to kick out the 0 for now, but I promise I will talk about that in later sessions. And to make this a little bit nicer, what we can do is we can right click here, go to format. You can actually adjust the way that this month displays by going to axis, dates, scroll down to custom, and then MMM-YY. And now that gives you an abbreviated month with the abbreviated year. I'm going to right click again up here, go to format title. I'm going to have my shading, and that looks nice. I like to make the line a little bit thicker so it's a little bit more pronounced. So to do that, you just go to size, and remember earlier that we had those bars that in our bar graph that were kind of proportionally sized. Well, now we're adjusting the size for this line graph, and you can adjust it just like this to make it a little bit thicker. You also see this new option here, this path. You can play around with the settings here to make the line graph look different. You can make it dashed. I think that looks a little too goofy. I'm just going to go to this option here with a solid line. Now we just need to build the histogram. So here's our histogram. This is basically kind of like a bar graph, but we have this bin here, which is going to contain ranges of ages. Here I've just set the range to 5 years. So I'll show you how to build that next. I'm going to build a new worksheet. I'm going to go here, I'm going to say histogram, apply. Now in order to get that histogram, we need to calculate age, which means we need to do another calculation. Now, we keep doing this date diff calculation. I think this just lends itself very well to that, so I'm going to duplicate this again. I'm going to rename this length of stay to age, and then I'm going to edit this so that we have something a little bit different. We're going to do year, all lowercase year, and instead of the start date of the encounter, we need the birth date of the patient. And I'm just going to say that this needs to be up through the final day of 2022. To have a fixed date, you have to use these pound symbols here. And then I'm going to say 12/31/2022. Apply that. Now we've got our age. But we need to set it up as a bin. Now to create bins, I just right-click here. I go to Create, Bins, and I'm going to make that 5. All right, so that's done. Now let's think about this again. We want to make this histogram where the bars will be sort of horizontally placed. So I'm going to take my age bin here. I'm going to make that columns. We want the frequency of encounters. To get the number of encounters by the age range, we want the frequency of encounters. Again, that's represented by our row count. So I drag that here, and now we have our histogram. We could just right-click here, Format Title. I'm going to make the shading a little bit more gray. Now, just histogram isn't great, so I'm gonna maybe just call this Patient Age Histogram. I'm going to label this Patient Age Histogram. Histogram. Now all we need to do is assemble all the pieces into the dashboard. So we're going to go here, click Dashboard, different size. I'm going to click on this drop down to Fixed Size. I'm going to pick Generic Desktop because I think that's a good generic size. And all we got to do is just start sliding these pieces into place. And sometimes it takes me a while to get this in the right format, but I'm just going to start dragging and dropping things. I'm going to remove this legend. I'm going to take my number of encounters and I'll plug that in right here. I don't need this title here. Number of unique patients, I'll put that over here. Don't need that title. Got our inpatient average length of stay. Drag that over a little bit. I'll hide that title. Got the ER median time. I'll drag that over here. Hide that title. Push this over a little bit. Going to left click, and I'm going to say Fit Entire View so that it's centered. And we'll explore all of these bells and whistles later on when we get to the section where I talk exclusively about dashboards, which will be Module 8. So if you're lost right now, don't worry. We're just kind of setting up a dashboard so that you can see how Tableau works and how it functions. My objective for you is to just kind of get used to this environment, and so it's not completely intimidating when you start building your own dashboards. Next, we need to bring in the line graphs. So I'm going to take this encounters over time. I'm going to drag it up here till I see this gray line. That's going to push everything down a little bit. And the last piece is just this one right here. So I'm going to drag that over here. And now you have created your first dashboard. And it's a little rough around the edges, but now we have the beginnings of a dashboard. And it's starting to look really nice. Drag this down a little bit more, and then drag that over, drag this over, so that these start to get stacked a little bit. And I'll drag that over a little bit. Now let's say you're looking at this and you're like, oh no, I want to make this a gradient. How do I get back into this worksheet to edit it? Well, you can left click here, and then you can go down to this arrow, and then you can click Go to Sheet. Or you could have just, if I click back to this dashboard, you could just go back to the patient age histogram. You'll see a preview of it if you hover your mouse over this tab, and then you can see this. You can go back into that worksheet and keep editing that worksheet. I'm just going to hold down my control key and just complete that gradient coloration there. I'm going to go back to my dashboard, and there you go. Now I'm going to save this because I don't want to lose any progress here. So I will go up to File. I'm going to save to Tableau Public As. And then I'll call this my first Tableau dashboard or something like that. You save that. You might be prompted to log into your Tableau public account. I'm already logged in myself. And it's going to publish this in a spot where everyone can see it. And it's going to be beautiful, and you might get some likes and some views. Now, I know that was a marathon. I threw a lot at you. And I find that the best way to learn these things is to just dive right in. So we're going to learn so much more about Tableau. As we get deeper, I'm going to explain how all these pieces come together. You are going to create beautiful visualizations by the time you're done with this, and you're going to be a lot more confident in Tableau. So I can't wait to see you in future lessons. And the next lesson, I've got plenty of practice problems for you to work through to kind of cement what you've learned so far into your brain. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.